Okay, so I think we can now make a start. Okay, good evening and welcome to the final webinar of Eastern Community Homes, We Do Housing Differently. My name is Kieran Carr. I'm part of the Eastern Community Homes team and work for Cambridgeshire ACRE, who are hosting the Eastern Community Homes Hub. In tonight's session, we're looking to pull together the information that has been discussed during the event at previous sessions around the development of community-led housing and the growth in the CLH movement, and also answering some of the questions you may have about how you can move from an idea or an aspiration to actually living in your own home. To do this, we've gathered a group of professional experts in their various disciplines. A panel has experience in a range of topics, including incorporation and governance, design and build, management of schemes and funding. And I hope we can draw on some of that expertise in the next hour. So before I ask the panel to introduce themselves, I'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping. As you can see, the webinar is being hosted on Zoom, so that provides us with the opportunity to record the event and make it widely available. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat function where you can introduce yourself to fellow delegates, and there's also a Q&A function where we would like you to post your questions to the panel, and we will pick these up later on. At the end of the event, you will be prompted to complete a short feedback form, which will help us organise future events. Now, I have been informed you won't be allowed to eat tonight without completing that form. So it's very important that you do that. Okay, so I'm now going to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and the work they do that's connected with community-led housing. So Fiona, if you could start, please.
Thanks, Kieran. Hello, everyone. My name's Fiona Wharton. I'm a partner at Wrigleys Solicitors. The clue is in the title, I guess. Our expertise lies in the legal side of helping community-led housing projects. As a firm, we have a dedicated community-led housing team, and that includes probably about 15 solicitors, I think, and we cover 3 different disciplines, main disciplines. So as Kieran said, around incorporation and governance, that's around legal structures and governance issues generally. And I'd add on to that sort of commercial contracts, because quite often groups need to contract with third parties. The second area is around property law matters. So that usually is around development agreements and sort of acquisition of sites and that sort of thing. And the final one is around funding agreements, and that can be a variety of things depending on where funding is being sourced from. We work with groups all over the country, although our offices are based in Leeds and Sheffield and Newcastle, and we've worked in this area, team members have worked in this area probably for around 30 years. So we've got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge that we share amongst the team with this area. So thank you very much for inviting us here tonight.
Thank you, Fiona. Isobel, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Isobel Wright. I'm the Regional Development Manager for Hastoe Housing Association in the East region. We are a specialist rural housing provider. We cover the East region. We also have another development region in the Southwest as well. We specialise in rural housing, and we partner with several different community groups, from parish councils to CLTs and other community groups with other aspirations for affordable housing in rural areas.
Thank you, Isobel. Debbie, over to you.
Yes, good evening, everybody. My name is Debbie Wildridge, and I'm a technical community-led housing advisor for the East of England. I'm currently working for an organisation called Locality, but I have been covering the 6 counties in the East of England on community-led housing for the last 7 years, and helped, I think it's 32 and counting, 32 groups to set up. I've worked with all the rest of the panel. Fiona, I don't think I've met, but certainly I've worked with Wrigleys before. Isobel and I worked together on a scheme in Lavenham. Rowan and I have worked together on some developments in East Cambridgeshire, and I've been a contributor to some of the excellent reports which Joe has written. So you've got a great panel of experts here to consult with. I live in Bury St Edmunds, so I'm based in the centre of the east of England, and I'm currently working in particular in Great Yarmouth and the Tendering district, but also working with all of the technical advisors that Eastern Community Homes have.
Thank you, Debbie. That's brilliant. Joe.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. My name's Jo Lavis. I'm a specialist in rural affordable housing delivery and have been doing that for over 35 years, working first of all at community level like a rural housing enabler or CLH advisor, and then actually most of the time working on national policy. I'm the vice chair of the East Midlands community-led housing hub, so the equivalent of the East of England one, but obviously a different region. And until January, I was also vice chair of the National Community Land Trust Network. I think the main reason that I'm actually here on the panel today is though because I'm a planner, and a couple of years ago I wrote a guide for planners to community-led housing, which, as I said at the beginning of that guide, was very much an evolving area of policy, and it keeps moving forward, which is really helpful. And I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's points and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And Rowan.
Yes, thanks. Yes, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rowan Haysom, and I'm a director at Haysom Ward Miller Architects. We're a Cambridge-based practice, and for the last 9 years or so, we've been involved in a number of community-led developments across the whole of this region. We've been working with the Streatham and Wilburton Community Land Trust. We're at Manor Farm at Streatham. We've now completed 75 homes and have plans for a further 25 there. And we also have a scheme of a similar size in Wilburton. And I've worked on many other community-led schemes, including the new almshouses for the Great Shelford parochial charities, which was presented yesterday on this forum, and which we're very excited and proud about. So thank you for inviting me to be here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rowan. Okay, so to start the session, all our panelists have been set some homework. We're not going to market, but we think this will be something that will be good to stimulate discussion and questions. So we've set a question that's we want them to answer from their perspective and area of work, and we've asked them to answer the following. From your professional experience, what would you consider to be the 3 biggest opportunities when creating community-led housing? And how would you suggest groups harness these opportunities? So we're going to go in the same order because that keeps it simple for me. So Fiona.
Thanks, Kieran. When I was thinking about this, I found it quite challenging actually, because every time I came up with an idea that was the sort of biggest opportunity, it seemed also to be probably the biggest challenge as well. So I was thinking about things like, you know, the great flexibility that you might have to kind of create your own sort of project and design your own homes and all that kind of thing. But of course, the more flexibility you have, the less of a framework you've got, and it's almost, you know, a challenge to kind of work out exactly what it is that you want to do. And I think when we're working with groups, I think, you know, preparation and trying to kind of get a kind of proper plan in place to start with is a really good thing. The other kind of thing I was thinking about is around, and I suppose this is from experience and having kind of discussed with the wider group, the variety of different projects that we work with. Really pleased to see people representing kind of rural housing, which is a thing that I'm quite keen on, because I think that kind of area is something that doesn't always get touched by the bigger housing providers and stuff in the same way. So we've been working with groups who are specifically working in quite difficult and challenging sites that really nobody else wants or wants to repurpose in any way, or indeed looking at things like repurposing sort of small market towns where there's empty properties and stuff like that. So again, you know, thinking about the types of huge different types of projects that you can come across. I've done quite a lot of work with some of the other hubs nationally, so it's quite interesting to hear the types of projects they're working with. So some of the more urban hubs clearly are working with quite challenging areas sometimes in different ways. So that can be quite a different kind of objective that they've got. So again, there's lots of opportunities there because you can kind of create your own path, but actually having that sort of that huge variety in the sector is both a challenge and an opportunity, I guess. And then the other sort of side of it I was thinking about really is in terms of connecting with the sort of community. Obviously the clues slightly in the title already, but what we find working with people is that they're really passionate about what they do and they're really keen to connect with that local community, and clearly things like consultations and working with other organisations based locally, whoever they are, can be really successful. But I would say, again, my message with a lot of these things, whilst there's lots of opportunities there, is that the preparation is really key. Because what we find is that you know, getting people on board at early stages is really good. I've just had one project a couple of months ago where you know, everything was go, and then the local authorities pulled out at the last minute. So it's, you know, it's that sort of thing which is, it can be really difficult. So it's really about harnessing all those opportunities, but making sure that you are prepared and get the ducks in a row in order to make sure that things develop as you would love them to develop, because it would be such a shame if they couldn't.
Thank you, Fiona. I think it's really interesting you're talking about preparation, because the discussions we've been having over the sessions and with groups that have been engaging with us has been about that importance of understanding what's required to do this, and that it is quite a long journey. So thank you. That's really useful. Isobel, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree with everything Fiona just said. It's very much preparation is key. Getting, like I say, all the ducks in a row, absolutely. So from my point of view, I'm obviously coming at this from a housing association perspective, and how we deal with communities that want to sort of go down this road. Sort of key things that I would really say is the community have more control over the process. They can influence and shape the development. They basically will make sure that they deliver absolutely what that community needs. And I think that's a really key and important thing to do with, you know, community-led. This is exactly what it says, community-led housing. Secondly, you get more community buy-in, as Fiona said, more consultation. Hopefully leads to less opposition, because the community have that involvement, have that buy-in right from the very beginning, and totally understand the process and what it is that, you know, they're trying to deliver. You can never do too much consultation. That's how I see it, very much so. And thirdly, it's a long-term stewardship. The community is so involved in that. It's the community's project, and it's a partnership between us as the housing association and the community as a whole. And I think, again, that's something you know, money can't buy, really. And I think that they can take away from that something, you know, a really strong bond.
Thank you, Isobel. Yeah, I think you said the word community a number of times there, and I think that's obviously something that's sort of inherent into the whole process around community-led housing. Okay, Debbie.
Yeah, I can see this is going to get progressively difficult for the person who's last, because we will have come up with all the ideas, and we've got to try not to say community too many times, otherwise we're going to get ticked off. I think that, as Isobel was saying, and Fiona too, it's about community cohesion. In my experience, it brings together people who are looking for a positive outcome. In some cases, they've been a group of people who've not known each other, other than perhaps being neighbours or living in the same area, but working towards something which is positive, and particularly where many people have an easy view of being defensive or having a negative view about housing. We live in a predominantly rural area, and there is a lot of resistance to developments which people feel are inappropriate, of the wrong size, and they've got very little chance to influence it, or they feel that it's being done unto them rather than they've been part of it. I've got some nice examples of what I call serial development, where people have started off with one scheme. Rowan has mentioned Streatham and Wilburton. That's gone on from being scheme number 1 to scheme number 2 to scheme number 3, as they've seen the advantages of the affordable provision. They've then wanted to go on and do more. And there's another example in East Cambridgeshire. There's a small village called Swaffham Prior, where we did a smallish scheme to provide affordable housing. We thought that was going to be the end of it, but the trustees have now turned around and decided that they're going to do a heating system for the entire village. It's on the village only has access to oil, which is very expensive. So this is going to be a ground source heating system for the entire village. Not something that anyone had thought of when they first set up at the Community Land Trust, but just goes to show how as a group, as a powerful group, legally constituted, they've got the ability to do a lot of other community activities. And I think the third thing is the new relationships and partnerships which the community can build. And I suppose local authorities come to mind here. There is often, again, criticism because it feels like the local authority or the planning department or somebody is imposing upon villages and communities. And actually, by going through the process of finding partnerships and building those relationships, there's a much better understanding in both directions between the community and the authorities, and working together, they can achieve something which is better than the sort of defensive attitude which we often hear at the beginning, and we can turn whole communities round in the way that they look at community housing. So that's my pennyworth. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Debbie. That's really interesting, and what I was taking from that really was around promoting the positive. And I've got personal example of that. I was discussing before with members of the panel about a CLT that's been built in the village I live in East Cambridgeshire. And the consultation was excellent, and the whole scheme was repurposed in many ways, and people are now really on board with it. So that's obviously quite a key message. Okay, Joe, I know it's getting grudged, but now over to you.
Well, never mind a pennyworth, Debbie. I think that was a good baggage full and really helpful. I've come at it at a slightly different angle, but there will be some things which will obviously be repeated. The first is obviously what an opportunity to be inspired and energized by community action. I always am whenever I both see the schemes, but also talking to the people that have delivered them. They're just amazing. And for me, it's an opportunity to deliver sustainable development. We hear a lot about that banded word, sustainable development, but I think actually Debbie's just given a really good example. You know, this is about meeting a social need, affordable housing, environmental need, there you are, your ground source heating, but it could be allotments, open space, and sometimes providing workspace, or by the way that local people are employed in developing the homes, actually that can be an economic benefit. So, you know, community-led housing is sustainable development in practice, and I think that's a real opportunity, and one to always make sure that when you're thinking about the scheme, that you think about those three different elements and how you can maximise that through the development that the community and the others are supporting. My second is to do with, I think it was the point Isobel actually made, which was about bringing people together. So yeah, the opportunity for local planners and as other members of the local authority to work with communities and housing associations to provide those high quality homes. And I think that strength of the partnership is a real opportunity, and the opportunity to build that. And then linked to that, I've got again one that has been echoed by others, which is about bringing communities together in a shared endeavour and being able to shape development so that it creates a legacy and a long-lasting benefit for the community. And in terms of sort of then, what are the things to harness and to take forward? And again, this is a slight echo, but communicate with everybody that you can and early on. And that applies both to other people within the community, but also with the local authority. And again, I would make a plea that you involve planners very early on in that discussion. So again, echoing something that Isobel had said, and think it through. The next is about understanding what those people that you're working with also want to achieve, or the challenges that they face, and to think about how through the development that you are either proposing or supporting, you can meet those challenges and their requirements. You'll have a much easier path if you've already recognised what their needs are too. And to local authorities, I think you're harnessing the fact that this is a real opportunity to diversify the supply of housing and to really tailor it to meet the needs of those particular groups. So whether it is young people, whether it's older people looking for homes with care, and think about the range of community-led housing that can help deliver that. Things like co-housing, and is there an opportunity? And this is one of my latest things that I'm really keen to follow up, is something like a co-housing scheme in a rural area where actually you have some of the care as part of the package deal with that co-housing scheme. So many opportunities that I think, this is a fantastic thing to be involved with.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, that's a really interesting point with the pressures on health and social care. How something like co-housing could be a sort of solution in well-being as well as care provision being provided. So that's great. Okay, I'm afraid, Rowan, you have got the short straw.
Thank you.
But I'm sure you can add something to the conversation.
Yes, I think, yes, I mean, so much has been covered. But the one thing that sort of I'm very aware of is when we build, it's a massive intervention in the landscape. So the first thought, the first idea is just an idea of a design line. And if you think about historically, or just think of a field, and it crisscrossed with all sorts of footpaths, and over time and use, there's a kind of collective consensus that emerges, and the paths that are less trodden on grow back, the landscape claims it back, and those that are trodden on more often are etched into the landscape. And these are the paths that we walk along, and then we would have ridden along, and then driven along, and eventually built against. And so these design lines are what historically have shaped our towns and villages and cities. And because of this collective consensus, I call it, but the sort of silent understanding of what is fitting, what is correct, what is rooted, what's appropriate to the topography and the views, things tend to feel right, or at least they have, and they do in a lot of our old historic centres. But now we drive everywhere, and when we plan new developments, a lot of it is a kind of a mapping from above. And I think this can sometimes be quite abstract and quite detached. And I think it's so nice to try and explore ways for our towns and villages to be able to grow and expand through a process of collective consensus, where things are planned at eye level from an intimate understanding of the landscape and an understanding of those connections which already exist, which hold communities together. So that's the first idea. And the second is the idea of social capital. If you think about what gives a piece of land its value, again, historically, it would have been either its agricultural value or some value derived from the human activities and connections at that place, whether it's a crossroads or the networks or the quality of the relationships that exist in that place. And when we live somewhere, we invest our energy and time and love into that place. When we moved into the town where we now live, I became a governor at the local school. I became a trustee of a local charity. And in our street, we look after our neighbours, they look after us. And I think this is what gives a place its value. And so the beneficiaries of that value should be those who create it, not a land speculator who's able to extract that value in the form of a planning permission. So the third idea is really putting those two together. And I do think that there's a fantastic opportunity through community-led development, certainly where, in my experience, we've been able to help local people find a way to empower their own communities so that they can define for themselves how their neighbourhoods might expand and grow. And I think through very early engagement, we've been able to map those potential desire lines and connections and relationships. And this has certainly informed how these developments have taken place. And I think that by taking control of the process, the value that is realized can be channeled and has been channeled into those communities in the form of affordable housing and amenity spaces and other community assets. And so I really am very optimistic and hopeful, and I do think that that community-led development is really a fantastic way for housing to be delivered moving on into the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. That was a really different perspective, I think, and a strong message about the importance of place and how it impacts on people's lives, I think, which is very often something that we forget about in terms of housing development when you're not actually experiencing living in that place. So thank you for that. Some really stimulating and informative points raised by the panel there. The good news is we are getting questions now in the Q&A box. That's good news for me because it means I've got something to do. We have also got some pre-submitted questions that have come from the events that were held earlier in the week. What I'm going to do, I'm going to sort of mix and match with these. I'm going to start off with a couple of the pre-submitted questions. I've noticed in the Q&A box there are some crossovers as well. I'll try and direct the question to someone in the initial instance, and then by all means anyone else who feels they want to raise a point around it, please do so. So the first question that we've got raised is something I think, Fiona, from what you talked about is something you may be able to give an initial response to. What are the key factors to consider for a CLH group when they are deciding upon a legal structure?
I think, gosh, lots of things to think about. I think really, rather than getting bogged down in legal types, probably the thing to do is to start to think about really how, sort of two phases really, the kind of development phase and the sort of, if you like, operational phase when people are going to live in it, and think about how that's going to be run, where the ownership and the control of it's going to lie, who's got the skills to manage all of that. Is that going to be something that's done internally from the group, or is it something that needs to be sourced more widely? So I would think of it in terms of principles really, rather than thinking I need to be a CBS or a KIC or a company or something like that. I'd start thinking about it as, what do we want out of this? Do we want to control it? Do we want to open it more widely? Do we want to have it as a fixed group, or is it a group that's going to be a bit more fluid with people coming and going? Do we want mixed types of tenancy and ownership involved in the site? That very much depends on the different projects. and think about it like that, really, and think about, obviously there's things like funding, how is the thing going to be funded, because that can have an impact on the structure that you might want to create. Is it going to be funded from within the individuals, or is it something that's going in part or in whole, or is it something that's going to attract outside funding in some way, because that might influence what structure you want going forward as well. So I'd start to think about kind of what's important to you. When you get to the stage of thinking about what is that legal structure in terms of setting something up and incorporating it, I don't think we've got time really today to go through every single legal structure, but I would say that we do have a kind of guide to legal structures. I'm more than happy to circulate that to people if they want to get in touch with me directly, and we can email that out. We don't have it on the website, but if people could kind of get in touch, we're happy to kind of source that for people, because that will go through some of the more detailed aspects of what it is to be a community benefit society or a community interest company, or whatever it is. So I think people might find that easier to digest and then maybe ask questions afterwards. Okay,
thanks Fiona. Debbie, with the number of groups that you've worked with in the past, have you got any thoughts about that and the kind of thought processes they may go through?
I was just actually looking in the questions and answers section, and somebody has asked the question about the difference between rural and urban, and I think that's an interesting one. They've asked it along the lines of, is it more popular co-ops or discounted market sale in urban environments and more community land trusts in villages? And I think there is an element of that, in as much as some of the smaller villages that I've worked with, overwhelmingly the trustees who've come forward have not been the people who want to be recipients of these houses. They're doing it for altruistic reasons, and recognising that the community as a whole actually has a need for affordable housing, and so often they are community land trusts, benefit societies, and so I don't know whether that actually answers your question, Kieran, but we have dealt with all sorts of different inquiries. Typically co-housing and co-op inquiries have come from urban sources. Discount market sale is something which a lot of people are looking at in both rural and urban. So I've turned it into an urban-rural question. May well want to contribute to that. Okay.
Has anyone else got any further comment? Or we can move on. Okay, we'll move on. There is a question that's come up in the chat from Nigel. One, on many of these sessions, I've heard affordable housing, but no one has offered a definition around this, or whether there is a particular target price point, absolute or multiple of salary, and whether people are talking about affordable capital cost. Anyone, I was thinking maybe Joe, yes, if you're happy.
Okay, so there is it sort of splits into two. So there's what is affordable, and a definition of affordable housing by the more easy one first. So the affordable by tenure. Within the National Planning Policy Framework, there and in the glossary at the back, it defines what is meant by affordable housing, and it talks about it as housing being available to people who cannot buy in the open market or rent in the open market. And then it lists a number of different tenures which are then classed as being affordable housing. However, there are questions about the extent to which some of those tenures are actually affordable. And usually that is defined. Affordable rented housing would be usually where someone is not spending more than 35% of their income on rent. And for buying, that they're not spending more than, as a household, not spending more than 3.5 times a single person in that household's income. I think it's 2.5 or something, where it's a dual income that's taken into account. So there are I hesitate to call them industry standards, but there are in terms of definition. I think the question very clearly identifies just how important it is that you know what the income is of, or the income bands of the people that you are trying to provide housing for, and ensuring then that it is affordable against those benchmarks. I would just pick up something that Debbie answered, which will probably come up once or twice actually, but Debbie mentioned discounted market sale housing. One of the things which I've come across in Cornwall, and it's worth having a look at Cornwall's SPD, supplementary planning document, for housing. And in the back of that, they have a formula for calculating what would be affordable to somebody on a median value, and that then informs the discount which applies to the discounted sale housing. So the price at which it is sold at initially, and the percentage discount which carries on into the future.
Okay, thank you, Jo. That's really useful. I'm going to slightly change now. This is a question that has come in for Rowan. Rowan, on some of the case studies yesterday, there was a strong green sustainable focus, and I believe that the Great Shelford is a passive house standard. However, there was an implication that passive house was costing more. It would be great to understand if there is a premium and roughly what this might be. This capital premium should be offset by the operational costs. Question mark.
Yes, I think that there clearly is a premium for passive house, but I think that a lot of people use the term passive house sort of quite broadly. Passive house is actually a building system that's come out of Germany, and if you want to have your house certified as that, you have to follow their very strict construction guidelines, which even involves the people on site, the contractor and the subcontractors actually doing a course and being certified to be able to do that work, and the designers as well. I think that can add maybe 7 to 8% on the build cost. That's a number that that people tend to suggest. It can be more than that, but I don't think you necessarily would undertake a passive house hoping to get that money back through reduced running costs. You can do that, and if depending on the supply and other things like that. But I think that what a lot of people understand is at the moment the planning system has energy performance certificates, which is the same sort of EPC that comes when you buy a fridge or a freezer or something like that. And so what we often aim for is to achieve an A star, which people sort of understand that, because that's what you might do if you want to buy an appliance or something. And you can achieve that in a way that is perhaps less involved than the passive house. And I think that could, whatever you do, that can actually reduce the running costs. And I certainly think if you're involved in affordable housing, that really is a priority. And I think any community-led housing, there's always a desire to actually be aspirational when it comes to this sort of thing. But the reasons for doing it have so much more to do with the environment and wanting to do things properly. And I think reducing running costs for the residents is a sort of added benefit to that as well.
Okay, thank you, Rowan. That's great. We did have a question that came up at the Housing Association event, and this is for you, Isobel, particularly from a Housing Association perspective. How would you advise groups to go about approaching a housing association to form a partnership? Is this direct contact through the LA, or does the Housing Association contact the group?
From my perspective, direct contact is absolutely fine. So what I would say is from our point of view, get us involved as early as possible. It's great if you're just thinking about it and you haven't even gone anywhere down the line, get us involved at that stage. From our point of view, the earlier the better. because from basically, if you're wanting to partner with an HA, if you're looking to do it so that, you know, we basically carry the costs of construction, etc. If you can get us involved early doors, it's great, because we've had instances where communities have gone down the planning route and come to us with a scheme which has got planning, and basically it's, you know, it's ended up being quite an expensive scheme to deliver. So if you can get us involved early doors, we can have those conversations, because obviously we've got that expertise as to how expensive things are going to be, and it's helpful if you can involve us early. But there's no reason why you can't have a chat with the LA or the rural housing enablers through the hub as well, because there are several different. There's lots of housing associations. We're not the only one. I mean, obviously we're the best, but we're not the only one. So, you know, it's the most important thing is probably speaking to several and making sure that you get the right partner for you, because everyone's different. Everyone has different ways of working, and you know, just because we do a lot of rural and a lot of community-led schemes doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be the right fit for everybody. So I would say, and I say this to, you know, speak to at least three different housing associations to make sure that you get the right fit for what it is you're wanting to do and what you want to achieve.
Yeah, good advice. Shop around.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I'm going to throw this question open to the panel. We've had it as pre-submitted, but it's also come up on the Q&A. It's around local connection and how you ensure that CLH is for local people, and also how do you ensure that the affordable housing remains affordable in perpetuity. And I presume there's a few aspects to that. There's the legal aspect as well as tenure and those kinds of things. Would anyone like to have a go at that first? Yes, Joe.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Right, local connection first of all, and I'm sure that Debbie and Isobel will also have experience of this as well. So I'll just answer it quickly from my perspective, and I'm sure they can elaborate. So certainly what I've seen is that Section 106 agreements, so the planning agreement, which usually accompanies the planning permission, will often have as an addendum to that a local lettings policy, which allows then or makes sure that the homes are met to people with a local connection, and that will be defined often actually within the Section 106. So that's one way of doing that. In terms of the perpetuity, Section 106 is quite important in terms of that as well. It will often require that the properties are retained as affordable in perpetuity, where they are affordable housing. It's easier where it's a standalone community-led housing group like CLT, or particularly a CLT actually, where, and I'm sure that Fiona will have more views on this as well, where the legal structure requires that the assets are retained in the form of a community benefit in perpetuity, and CLT's legal structure certainly allow that, but I'm sure that, as I say, Fiona can give more information on that. From a rural perspective, perpetuity is relatively easy to maintain, where the development is done with a housing association. Properties are exempt from the right to acquire. That's not the same as the right to buy, the right to acquire. And there are ceiling caps which are put on the amount of equity that somebody buying a shared ownership home can buy. And then in an urban context, again, going back to the discounted market sale, actually, I think my feeling is that's maybe, and others may have other ideas, but possibly the only way in which you can ensure that certainly affordable sale housing is retained as that in perpetuity. And I've got a question actually for Fiona myself, which is one of the things which I've sort of considered and I have seen done in Scotland, is where something goes in as a covenant on the deed of sale, which restricts the use of the land and I'm assuming therefore the property's built on it for a certain use, and I just wonder if that's also a way of assuring perpetuity.
Shall I jump in there, Kieran, if that's all right?
That's fine, Fiona.
Thanks. So in answer to Joe's question, I'm not a property lawyer. So in terms of deeds of covenant on properties, sale, title deeds and things like that, I probably defer to my property colleagues. It sounds like something that is possible. I don't know, so don't quote me on what the implications of that might be and how, if you like, watertight it would be, and whether you could kind of change it further down the line. So I might come back to you on that one. In terms of the sort of governance side of it, yes, you're right. Clearly, you can build in asset locks to different structures. There can be community benefit societies, there can be KICs, there can be charities, all sorts of things that you can build into them. For some, they are statutory, so therefore you can't get around them, and therefore what you put into that asset lock is there forever and provides your perpetuity. For others, they are, if you like, contractual between the individuals who have signed up to that structure. So it is an agreement between the members or shareholders of the organisation, and therefore is something that is as watertight as any contract, really. So there's slightly different nuances between how the organisation is structured, but in terms of building in an asset lock, yes, you can do it. And if that is something that you want to do, it is another one of those factors that might influence the type of structure you want to be when you're putting together that jigsaw puzzle of trying to create the legal structure that you need.
It sounds like you need good legal advice. Debbie, I think you raised your hand as well.
That was before I heard what Joe had to say,
okay.
And between Joe and Fiona, they know more than I do, so I defer to them.
Okay, no, that's fine, thank you. So moving on, we have a question that's come up in the Q&A, and one that was pre-submitted at a previous event as well, which is about neighbourhood planning. They're very similar, actually. I'll read the question on the. Oops, it's just moved. Excuse me a second. I'll read the question I've got in front of me. What are the panel's views on neighbourhood planning, and how by undertaking a neighbourhood plan, communities can bring forward community-led housing in their neighbourhood? What are the advantages and disadvantages to this approach? Would anyone like to comment on that? Yes, Debbie.
I'll give it a go. Isobel and I worked on a scheme in Lavenham where they had a neighbourhood plan, and what arose from the neighbourhood plan was a clear identity that affordable housing was needed. And I often say that a community-led housing project is the natural follow-on to a neighbourhood plan. Neighbourhood plans take time to do. They can get mired in bureaucracy, and at the moment I know there are a lot of neighbourhood plans that I'm connected with, and we're all desperately waiting for the opportunity to be able to have referendums. They're ready to go, but there's been a pause on them. So I'll hand over to Joe at that point, but I would say that there is a natural connection between affordable housing and, you know, where it's come up as a requirement in a neighbourhood plan.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. I was just going to, I think, probably 4 points. I think the first is just to ask yourselves, is your aim to do a community-led housing scheme or to do a neighbourhood development plan? Because if your interest is in doing community-led housing scheme, actually you might be better off just going straight down that route. As Debbie says, you know, neighbourhood plans are much broader in scope. They have a very, very formal process which they have to go through, including examination. And they do take time and effort to do. They can be absolutely fantastic in what they provide for the community in terms of being able to shape development in the future, but they are quite short-lived as well, and need to be kept under review. So yeah, those are some of the downsides. However, if you are going to go down a neighbourhood planning route, I think I would suggest probably 3 things. The first is to check what's in your the local plan for your area, and are there policies within that which actually are fine? So you don't have to repeat them in the neighbourhood plan, but you might want to tailor them or expand them so that they meet your needs. So there might be a policy in the local plan which is about provision of affordable housing. In the neighbourhood plan, you might want to expand that to say affordable housing and to be delivered by, and you could say a community-led housing group, but you must also say housing association or other providers. So you can't just say for a community-led housing group, but you can put that peg down in the sand, which is helpful. The other is to think about what other parts of the policies in the neighbourhood plan you might feed in, something around community-led housing. And I'm going to do a little plug. It's not a Radio 4 programme, but a little plug. In the back of the guide for plans that I did, there is a section which is about community-led housing in neighbourhood development plans. And I think it's worth looking at that because it's about plugging community-led housing and mention of it in a number of policies within the plan. And the other is just to think about one of the things neighbourhood plans can do. Obviously, it can have a rural exception site policy in a rural context, but they might also want to look at whether they're going to allocate sites for development. And you could require, say, for example, that some of that development is done through community-led housing. So I know that the schemes that Debbie and Rowan have been involved with, actually, it's that sort of process, isn't it? Where part of a market site is developed as a community-led housing. And just be clear that, you know, there is a process of due diligence which you must go through in terms of identifying sites for allocation. But there are certainly examples, and at an event I was at 3 weeks ago, an example of a scheme in Cheshire, which is a site which was allocated in the neighbourhood plan and is now providing homes for old people for that community. So there's definite opportunities there.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, Ron.
Yeah, just leading on from that, I think that the neighbourhood plan is really a policy document, and this question of rural exception sites is really important here because on the one site that we had, it took a while, you know, while we were sort of in the planning stage, the planners thought that they might actually incorporate that site into the development framework of the village. And that was a sort of shock horror moment for the CLT because as soon as that had happened, it would have increased the value of the land to such an extent that it would have been unaffordable. So there is something that we have to be very careful about. If you're developing a neighbourhood plan, if you allocate a site, that affects the land value, and that might make it unaffordable for a community-led development that is reliant on land values not being so extortionate that you can only develop market housing on that site. So I think that the neighbourhood plan has to be very careful of how it allocates and what the sort of the small print is on that allocation. If it's allocated for a community-led development or for affordable housing, then that will affect the value, and you sort of need to be careful to get that in place right at the start. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Rowan.
Can I just add just a
yes,
tiny
Joe.
little bit to that? And I think it is, and I agree entirely with what Rowan says, but it's that thing about threading it through the policy. And if in the policy in your neighbourhood plan, you're asking for a contribution from affordable housing, and there is a question about how big a site you need in order to be able to do that. But if you do, in the neighbourhood plan, that is another example where you can ask for part of that affordable housing to be delivered potentially through a community-led housing group. So that thing about that's where the community-led housing group potentially then has access to land which has a slightly depressed value because it's coming through as affordable housing as part of a market development.
Thank you, Joe. I'm conscious of time. We've got 5 minutes left. I think we can squeeze a couple more questions in. One thing that was very much a theme that's been running through the events on all the sessions was around finding suitable and financially viable land, because that's often what holds up community-led housing groups, especially in the east of England, and it's associated with land prices. How can we identify more available land, and what strategies could be put in place with local authorities and other landowners? Isobel, do you want to start off with that?
Well, that's a good question. Probably, I mean, there's different ways to identify sites. Sort of how we've always done it in the past is we do sort of village walkarounds with the parish, look at every piece of land in the parish and sort of draw them out on a map, and then get sort of planners' proposals as to what's developable and what isn't. And then it's a case of contacting landowners. Other options are to do a call for sites, which is what we initially did at Lavenham. We sort of basically sort of advertised that we were looking for land, or Debbie did actually, and see if you can get any interested landowners that way. Hopefully they're interested rather than you sort of cold calling people, which is, you know, the other way around it. It is harder now than it was probably 10 years ago to get land at affordable rates, mainly because landowners are a lot more savvy now than they probably were then. They tend to involve land agents and things a lot more than they would have done back then. What I would say is, obviously, going back to what Rowan was saying, is obviously if the sites aren't allocated, they are only, they don't have an open market value. They are only, the only thing you can deliver on those sites if they're outside of the development boundary is an exception site or community led, or you know, they affordable housing is all that you can develop on those sites. So they do have a reduced land value. So there may be aspirations that they're going to be getting open market value, but in reality that they don't have that value attached to them. But yes, it is not as easy as it used to be. I will say that. But you know, there are still landowners out there that are still very much keen, and there are still, you know, ways around things, and it's just a case of putting your hat on the post and hoping that, you know, you get someone involved. But with the community-led housing, the beauty of it is because it's community-led, you do tend to get more landowners wanting to be involved in that process.
Thank you as well. That's really interesting. Yes, Joe. You're on mute, Joe.
Sorry, everyone. Okay. I was going to pick up an example from Bristol, which I think is particularly well, it's relevant in terms of disposal of local authority land, and that's both in an urban and a rural context. And we know that they can provide sites for affordable housing, not least Lavenham. But in Bristol, they use the Social Value Act to determine the value of land that they dispose of. And so they take into account the social value which the new use, whether it's just a use of open space, environmental or affordable housing, so what the social value is of that use which the land will be put to when they determine the value and the price at which they sell that land. They've got a really good policy on their website and a protocol for how they do that. And so it's definitely worth having a look at that. Just quickly, I saw somebody mention about a revolving loan fund, which could be used. And again, I'm not going to go into detail, but Cornwall Council have run one. And linked to that, it might also be worth looking at, I think it's, I was just looking it up actually, they've changed their name. It's the Community Housing Trust in Scotland. It used to be the Small Communities, Highland Small Communities Housing Trust. And they set up a revolving land bank fund. And I think that's something worth probably looking at too.
Okay, yes, Debbie.
Yes, if I could just add to that, Great Yarmouth have got a revolving loan available to community-led housing, and East Cambridgeshire have got one as well.
Thank you. That's really useful to know. Okay, we're just at 6:30, but to give everyone an opportunity to have one last word, I'm just going to ask one final question and ask people to just give a very brief response. Over the course of the event as well, a lot of people discussed how long it can take community-led housing schemes to actually get to the point where people are living in them. I think one example we heard was something like 13 years. From your perspective, how would you think, with one simple idea, you could speed things up that we could suggest as a hub in the east of England? So I'll start off with Fiona.
Goodness.
There's a challenge.
Yeah, indeed. So the word that keeps coming back to my mind is preparation, and perhaps focus. So people being clear about what it is they're looking to do. And I think it was maybe Isobel said earlier on, and it applies to housing associations if that's who you need to work with, but equally with other third parties, to get them involved early doors, so everybody's talking, and I think somebody else said the word communicating. With any sort of project planning, communication is so important, to try and make sure everybody's on the same page. But I think it all comes back under that heading of preparation.
Okay, thank you. Rowan.
Yes, well, I think two things really. Strong leadership, I think, is absolutely essential. To have a team of people who have shared skills and have the time and the energy and the resources to really push things on. And the other thing, what Fiona says, is communication. Certainly the Great Shelford scheme that I was involved in with the parochial charities there, one of the trustees was also on the parish council, so there was a direct line of communication between the parish council and the trustees, and it just meant that everyone knew what we were doing, and the information was being distributed throughout the whole community. And I think that it meant that there was a level of trust. Because there's good communication, there's good trust, and I think that got that sort of just dissipated any potential conflict. And so at the end there was just tremendous support, and I think it's that sort of support that you need in order to help drive it through. And so communication and leadership, really, I think that's what it'll come down to.
Brilliant, thank you, Rowan. Debbie.
Yes, I think I'm going to boast a little here. The shortest one I've ever done was a year, 8 weeks to set up a community land trust. There was a willing landowner, willing developer, willing housing association, and to my astonishment, we managed to get the whole thing done, and the first houses were being built within a year. However, that is not typical, and I think it was a very simple scheme with everybody knowing exactly what they wanted to do. But I think that it's having that support, that broad support. There was support from the local authority to do it. There was support from the parish council, and there was a very clear intention. My longest is 8 years and it's still counting. So it does vary widely.
Thank you, Debbie. Isobel.
Yeah, same as everyone else has said, really. It's one of those how long's a piece of string type things, how long schemes will take. Debbie's done well to get one in a year. I mean, I think, yeah, it's just a case of having a clear thought process at the very beginning as to what it is you want to actually achieve, and having that preparation right the way through, and involving all the different stakeholders as early as you can, to try and smooth out the process. I mean, I find that, the sticking point as a general rule tends to be finding a willing landowner. That's always going to be the bit that's the sort of hardest work. But once you've got that in place, the rest of it really should be reasonably straightforward, as long as you can keep everything, sort of everyone involved in that process, and getting the buy-in from the local authority and the planning authority, and everyone involved, basically. Yeah, so it's the same as everyone else has said, just preparation is key.
Thank you, Isobel. And finally, Joe.
Right, I agree with everything that everyone else has said, but just to add in a couple of other things, really is to illustrate just how important all those things are. I think something which has become very clear is that where you've involved community-led housing advisor or an RHE who is well plugged into the local authority planning and housing department, that can really help in terms of that informal negotiation and discussion behind the scenes, which can speed things up. And I think the other is a plea actually to local authorities from their part actually to also engage early. When I did some work that Debbie referred to earlier and I did an interview with East Cambridgeshire, and what they said was, yes, it takes us quite a bit of time at the beginning with these community groups, but actually then because we have ironed out most of the problems and the opposition early on, they then go through really quickly at the planning stage, which is often otherwise the other part, as Isobel said, after you found the land, it's planning sometimes where it can stick. So that would be my thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Apologies to those people who posted questions that we haven't covered. We will have a look at those and try and get back to people. We've got contact details for that. But in ending, first I'd like to thank our panel, Fiona, Isobel, Debbie, Joe and Rowan for their great contributions. I found it thoroughly enjoyable and thought-provoking, so thank you very much. I'd also like to thank you all for joining, and I'm sure you found it as interesting as I have and thought-provoking. As I mentioned, all 5 webinars this week have been recorded and they will be made available via our website, which is easterncommunityhomes.com. As I said, if anyone has any unanswered questions or would like to discuss what we do at Eastern Community Homes and how we can help further, you can also contact us through the website. And again, that's easterncommunityhomes.com. Please don't forget to complete your feedback forms if you need to eat. And so formally, I'll close this Q&A session and the event as a whole, and wish you all an enjoyable evening. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.